I won't lie, some part of me didn't really want to do this review. This game is almost single-handedly responsible for my affection for RPGs, though I wouldn't discount either Wild Arms or The Legend of Dragoon for their hands in the affair. It's probably the most played game of my childhood, despite the fact I never actually beat it before today, literally the same day I'm writing the script. My folks split up and I suddenly lost access to the PS2 I was playing it on right as soon as I was reaching the end. I did still have, and even today still have, those PS2 games alongside their cases, X and X2. But some part of me never really wanted to beat it now that I have it on multiple consoles and actually have the time and resources to do so. The more I think about it, the more I feel that there were very few games from my childhood I actually beat. Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 2, 3, and Teen Titans are the only ones I can even think of off the top of my head, tied to that same console at least. But it can't stay like that forever, right? Final Fantasy X, originally developed by Squaresoft in the far-off year 2001 and remastered in 2013 by the now-named Square Enix, is considered to be one of the best entries in the series, and even was the first to feature voice acting, a big deal at the time. It follows Tidus. Yes, I know it's technically pronounced Tidus, but no, and I'm going to not pronounce the game properly as a show of protest, and not at all because I kept calling it that until I was a teenager. In his adventures protecting Yuna in the world of Spira. Of course, because it's a JRPG, this base premise gets complicated over time, and suddenly you're saving the world using the power of friendship, and your swords, and magic, and soccer balls, and summons. The summons, here called Aeons, play an interesting part of the story. See, Yuna is a summoner, and despite her young age, she decides to trek on a pilgrimage like her father before her, a journey across Spira, gathering the Aeons until she's amassed enough power to attain the final Aeon and thus take on Sin, a big bad scouring the world and consuming all in its path. I really like when a gameplay mechanic is explained and justified through lore in the game. Tyranny did something similar with its Archons, and Dark Souls had its Dark Sign premise. I just love seeing stuff like this. I feel like there's a technical term for it, but I don't know it. The combat is only explained in that the world has fiends, so defending yourself is pretty par for the course. No lore explanation as to why it's turn-based, but that was a staple of JRPGs at the time. Another staple, unskippable cut scenes. If there was anything that Square should have changed in the remaster, it would have to be the unskippable cut scenes. Unfortunately, outside of FMVs, they didn't. You can't even speed them up using the boost speed feature brought in with the remaster. It's a damn shame. On a first playthrough, it's not as annoying as it probably could be, but on a second playthrough, or against a difficult boss with an overly long cutscene pre-combat, it's a different story. It's made worse when, well, I'll talk about that later. Despite the fact that the summons play such an integral part to the story, you don't have to get all of them. In fact, the game has 8, arguably 9, considering one of the summons is a duo, and you only need 5. Those 5 you don't even need to go out of your way to get, you just naturally obtain them as the story progresses. In fact, up until nearly the end of the game, it's incredibly linear. Technically, there's branching paths where you walk, but they're offshoots and mostly just lead to loot. Optional loot, at that. But once it properly opens up, there's a fair amount to do. Some stuff, however, is tied to items that you can no longer obtain because they're in places that you can't go back to, things that you can miss if you don't pay attention, which then lock off other things as a result. Some of these things, like those tied to the Al-Bhed Dictionary side quests, can carry over between playthroughs and saves, and they're less important to worry about. Others don't have that benefit. Aeons and one specific one's summoning requirements is a good example. However, the ones you can get regardless can be interesting. This is Yojimbo. Yojimbo's an optional Aeon who isn't exactly off the beaten path. In fact, he's in one of those offshoots I mentioned earlier that normally house simple optional loot, which I guess he could technically be considered as. He is interesting because through a mixture of luck and arguably tedious min-maxing, he can absolutely shit on even the hardest bosses, and when I say that, I need to stress that I am not kidding. Apart from a very select few enemies, Yojimbo can instantly kill anything and everything in his path in the game if you pay him and he likes you. Through enough grinding, and in my case using the special parameters provided by the game, you can effectively do the same thing for the characters in your party, albeit with some catches. I enjoy the fact that through the sphere grid, you can more or less multi-class a character, allowing for a range of versatility on everyone. But, and here's the problem, it takes time to fill it up, especially if you're looking to get overpowered by actually having every single node on the grid filled. So every character has a max 255 stat on everything except for health and mana, whose base cap is 9,999 and 999 respectively. When I say it takes time, I don't mean minutes, I mean hours. Like actual hours just spent on the grid screen alone, even with the various boosts provided by the remaster. And to actually net the achievement for filling it out, you also have to have every single node connected through a character, which requires AP, obtained by beating enemies in combat. You get AP regardless of how much damage is dealt, though the character who deals a killing blow gets the most. This prioritizes having every character swing in a boss. You'll still need to grind to unlock the levels on the sphere grid though, and thus the achievement. You'll need to do this at least once if you want it, but another one requires you to do this for every single character, so 7 times. Even worse, the speed boost doesn't work in menus, so it doesn't work on the sphere grid either. It took me hours to fill every node and back and forth get all items parameter just to have everyone be horribly overpowered. A price I paid willingly, but that doesn't mean it isn't a problem. I have something close to 30 hours by the end. If not for the sphere grid, it'd probably be closer to 20. I shouldn't have to spend an actual third of my entire playtime in a menu, mashing a single button until I can't anymore, restock, then do it again. Another thing you'll likely be spending a good amount of time on is the combat. Like I mentioned earlier, the game features turn-based combat. You attack, they attack, repeat either forever or until someone's dead. There's some catches to this. While the game doesn't have the press turn system that the Shin Megami Tensei series does, there's still ways to circumvent or outright remove enemy turns. The most basic is probably haste and slow, very important, and there's still others. On top of this, there's some nuances to combat. Elemental weaknesses, status affliction, zombie being an almost constant fear mid to late game, especially against bosses, enemy placement on occasion. There's plenty to think about strategically in terms of both what you should do and who should do it. A flying enemy is probably not a good target for Auron, as he's all about breaking through slower, generally heavily armored foes. Waka, on the other hand, is great at dealing with them. Or, if that enemy has an elemental weakness, you could use Lulu and her magic to exploit that. If an enemy has zombie applied to them, you can ignore using magic altogether if you want, and instead throw potions at their face until they melt due to the whole undead thing. Plus, since different enemies are best dealt with using varied means, you're constantly switching around your party composition to better counter the enemies in front of you, so theoretically AP should be doled out relatively evenly. Mid to late game bosses also use these nuances to their advantage, turning their boss fights almost into puzzles, wherein you try to figure out their mechanics, what they can and can't do, what they're weak against since most bosses are immune to sensors, stuff like that. It's important that if there's turn-based combat in a game, it doesn't boil down to just hit and be hit forever. Speaking of puzzles, the world of Spira is littered with these temples of the faith and their cloister of trials, which act as puzzles. They are the main requirement for the Aeons that Yuna summons, some of which even have interesting lore implications beyond what I talked about earlier. Most of these temples are fairly simply designed with their own puzzle mechanics tied to them. Thankfully, they aren't much of a slog, mostly. They can slow down the pacing of the game, though. Another pseudo-puzzle thing is Blitzball. I've got mixed feelings on that. I think the biggest issue personally is that the matches could be faster. Also, the fact that there's an ultimate weapon tied to it kinda diminishes my want to do it. And I know that seems counterintuitive, but that's just how I feel. There's the same case for the other ultimate weapons. There's just so much to deal with, and I've already spent hours maxing everyone out. I don't want or need to obtain any of them. Plus, with Customize unlocked after having Riku for a bit, I arguably don't even need them. Customize allows you to, well, customize your weapons and accessories provided they have a blank slot. That's the only real issue I have there. You can't remove or replace an ability on your gear, only add one if it has a blank slot available. This is only really detrimental if you want to replace an ability with a stronger version of the same ability or don't need it anymore and want something much more useful. A nice touch to the equipment is that they're reflected on the character's model. Not really important, just something I think is nice. Less nice is that this PC port, it's not exactly the best. I've had a few visual glitches which are never fun, much less so when they occur during crucial moments in the story. The cursor isn't hidden or replaced with a custom cursor for the game like it is in the bonus menu, so you'll see it. Not the worst thing, though. Not by a long shot. Let me show you something.
What the?
That has been a constant issue throughout my entire playthrough. Anything that could be an FMV, no, that's a green screen now. It's actually almost ruined the game for me, and I've tried everything that's been suggested online. Uninstall and reinstall, changing power management, forcing it to use dedicated graphics instead of integrated through both Nvidia's control panel and Windows OS settings, forcing through compatibility to run as admin, then launching directly from the executable, and I think that last one is the reason I don't have some achievements despite completing their requirements. The only one I haven't personally checked yet is running it in borderless windowed, and I won't know until I go into the sequel. Even researching online, apparently this has been a problem since its launch, and especially an issue when it comes to Nvidia cards. I don't know why, but it's actually extremely detrimental. The only workaround I could use to any degree of success is closing the game fully, then relaunching it. The cutscenes work then for a while, and then next one pops up and the green screen comes back. It's actually infuriating. No, you know what? I'm not stopping there. Music is good. A lot of the time, games have something of a consistency when it comes to the music in their games, an overarching theme or genre normally. Final Fantasy X sometimes does, sometimes it doesn't. It's more a case about what's needed in the moments or in the situation than anything else. You've got some fantastic piano pieces, and the battle theme will be stuck with me until I'm dead, but the game doesn't stick to just one genre or subgenre, which is something I like. Each character even has their own theme, which is also nice, but there can be a clash sometimes. Finally arriving in Zanarkand and heading to the temple there is a good example. Over time, I also noticed that the piano in Zanarkand, that music you hear when Tidus begs you to listen to his story at the start of the game, is effectively referenced in other music. It acts as something of a backbone or an underlying theme, which I guess kinda disproves what I said earlier. Final Fantasy X is still my favorite JRPG ever, despite the constant intrusion by Mike Wazowski's asshole. There's plenty more I could talk about, like how there can be changes to cutscenes based on a background meter saying how much a character likes you, but honestly there isn't too much else I could talk about that wouldn't be either overly specific or ultimately unnecessary. I love it. I have no doubt that a good amount of that is nostalgia, but at least now I can say I've beaten it. I didn't do that because of how it used to feel when I was 10, I did that because I wanted to now. Everything changes, including my inability to finish a game, and sometimes that change comes at a cost. In this case, a proper, though unfortunately tainted farewell to something that clearly defined my childhood. And the only way they could really one-up something as franchise-defining as this is if they open their sequel by having a well-liked character such as Yuna become this globe-trotting treasure hunter and, alongside her cousin and a mysterious swordswoman, catch someone impersonating her at a concert.
I swear to fuck, if that's green screened, I'm gonna lose my goddamn mind.
Story up.